This is the Big Fish Cares Podcast. Big Fish Cares Podcast. And here's your host, Benny Fisher.
We're back with an exciting week. We're going to talk Steelers football, Hall of Famers, a little bit about Canton. We're here with my good friend Jim O'Brien again. Welcome back to the show, Jim. It's good to have you.
Well, this show, we're going to pretend like we're in Canton, your hometown.
Oh, okay. Walking the halls. Yeah, give me, I don't know, a little introduction to what your life was like, and then knowing the relationship with Canton, Ohio, as you saw, because you've lived through many decades. The Hall of Fame, I think, started in 1963, right? And then, the Steelers, came to dominance in the 70s, and you were already, by 1963, how old were you when they...
63 was the start of my senior year at the University of Pittsburgh.
Okay, so you were there when they had to make the decision where they're, going to make the Hall of Fame, build the Hall of Fame, all that stuff. All right, I'll let you take it from here.
I've had books of mine for sale at the Hall of Fame. I love to go to the Hall of Fame. As soon as you walk in upstairs, there's a Steeler display, and there's a front page of the Pittsburgh Press. And Jack Lambert's featured in the one front page story of this front page of the sports section. And there are stories by myself and Pat Livingston, who was the sports editor, and John Clayton, who was my sidekick at the time. And then John went on to greatness with ESPN as one of the insiders on the NFL. John worked very hard at, I don't know what he was like in recent years when you had cell phones and so forth, because he used to be dialing phones and so forth, and he just called every scout, every coach in America to get information about who was who. He outworked me in that regard. I had another life.
I think I met him. I met him at the Browns expansion draft back in 1999, happened at the Hall of Fame. There was only one team in the expansion draft, so it was kind of boring draft, but they did the ceremony there at the Canton Civic Center. My mom wrote me an early dismissal. The only time in my life that my mother would ever let me miss school for something like that, because I think I was, a senior in high school, and I was working at a grocery store, and the owner of the grocery store had tickets to the Hall of Fame, to this, not to the Hall of Fame, to the Civic Center for this expansion draft, and he gave me one of them because he knew I would really appreciate it. I remember leaving school early. I was the first person in line to let me in the door. Carmen Policy was the GM of the Cleveland Browns back then. He's a legend in San Francisco, and also from Youngstown. I feel like probably have some comments about that, but I remember just being there and taking a bunch of pictures, and I saw Bernie Kosar because he was there for old time's sake, and a lot of old Browns players were there, and John Clayton, Sal Palantonio, some of those guys I remember. I don't know. I think I remember meeting Chris Berman. I don't think I saw him there at that event, but I every year at the Hall of Fame, I would try to sit as close to Chris Berman because you could see him, because he was like 6'6", you know what I mean? And he's a big guy, and
with a big voice,
right? And as a kid in the '90s, that was I don't know. He was almost like my idol, you know what I mean? As far as sportscasters and stuff goes, like that, because he was fun, he was energetic, he always had the sayings. But Canton does bring back a lot of memories.
Well, you mentioned your mom, and I've got a mom story with the Hall of Fame, believe it or not. I was the editor of Street and Smith Basketball Magazine, which was the #1 basketball magazine in the country for over 30 years. I mean, that's where my kids got their college money. And the thing is that for some reason, Street and Smith out of New York City was printed, the book itself was printed in Canton, Ohio. And I'm sure it was because the costs were probably less in Canton, Ohio than they were in New York City. So it's the day before the book is going to press, and we're up against it, and it was necessary to take one last look at Street and Smith magazine before it went to press in Canton, Ohio. So my mother and I got her, she was a great proofreader, could spell well. And I got her up like 5 a.m. She looked like a puppy with her eyes half closed. I said, Mom, it's time to go. We're on our way to Canton. And we drove to Canton, Ohio, which was about a 2.5-hour drive from Pittsburgh. And we get to Canton, and we proofread the thing and put it to sleep on the press and so forth. And then I took my mother to the Hall of Fame, and you might remember there's a name, Pete Elliott. Pete Elliott was the director of the Pro Football Hall of Fame, and he had coached in college and so forth. Nice man, an ambassadorial type. That's why he was the head of the Pro Football Hall of Fame. He was so kind and so pleasant with my mom, and this was a big deal for my mother to be at the Pro Football Hall of Fame with her son Jimmy. And I remember that we had a hotel room, and my mother and I ordered some food to the room, which always included shrimp cocktail. I love shrimp cocktail, still do. And we're having a nice meal in our room, and my mother says to me, "You live pretty good, don't you, Jim?" And I did. I always recognized that. I always realized what a nice situation I had, being a sports writer for big-time newspapers in Miami and Philadelphia and New York and then in Pittsburgh. And being able to treat my mom to that visit and the way that Pete Elliott treated her and so forth. And she knew some football players because she was from Bridgeport, Ohio, which was close to Martin's Ferry, where the Groza brothers came out of there, Lou the Toe Groza, whom you know, and his brother Alex, who was an All-American basketball player at the University of Kentucky, got involved in a point-shaving scandal, and he had to quit playing basketball for the Indianapolis Olympians, and ended up, being a scarred figure. And yet he ended up, I knew him when he was the general manager of the Kentucky Colonels, one of the nicest men I've ever dealt with.
What's the Kentucky Colonels?
They were one of the best teams in the ABA.
Well, basketball, okay.
They should still be in the NBA. They had one of the most successful franchises. But John Y. Bryan worked some financial dealings where he made out, and he got an NBA franchise, but Louisville lost its franchise, and to this day, they're trying to get back into the NBA, and it was one of the best franchises and one of the ones that I like to deal with, and Alex Groza was one of the reasons that I like to deal with. The Hall of Fame, I went to the Hall of Fame for about 20 straight years for the induction ceremonies. Got press passes, stayed at a hotel there, got a parking pass, which was really, as you know, knowing that landscape, having a parking space near the Fawcett Stadium.
Yeah, that's what it used to be called. Now it's called something different. Who's the guy from New Orleans? They named it after him, the old owner of the Saints. I can't even think of it now.
Tom
Benson.
Tom Benson.
Tom Benson Hall of Fame Stadium. He donated $10 million. So for $10 million, they'll rename you.
Everything that I knew in those days, and when I say Fawcett Stadium, everything has a new name.
Yeah, no, you're right. Well, marketing, and they got to sell tickets. So that's they did make it nice though. Have you been up there? I mean, they totally reinvented the new stadium. I haven't been there either, but. It's all new up there now. I mean,
I have
everything.
to get up there. I'd like to take my mom, but that's not possible. But maybe I'll take my wife, Kathy. She would.
We should go. Me and you should just take a little trip over there.
Yeah, it's not that bad to get there. But I haven't seen it since they renovated. That would be nice. So we could then put that on our bucket list.
There you go.
But I like. I actually, when I was doing work on one of my books, the public relations people there took me to the basement of the Hall of Fame. And in the basement, they have a lot of display materials and paintings and photographs and
a lot of artifacts, I bet.
All sorts of things that were in earlier displays in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. They've replaced them upstairs with something new, perhaps. And I called it the hidden Hall of Fame. And I really thought, I made this suggestion to the Hall of Fame, that they should take that show on the road, because they did take the Hall of Fame on the road for a while there, and to the NFL franchise cities and so forth. But I thought it would be interesting. I remember seeing Bobby Lane's helmet that he wore when he played for the Steelers. I remember seeing a painting of John Henry Johnson, who was a star running back in his late 30s for the Steelers and also was a great back for the Detroit Lions and the San Francisco 49ers. He was a member of the 49ers' $1 million backfield, which really wasn't a $1 million backfield, but they had Hugh McElhaney and Joe the Jet Perry, and they had John Henry Johnson.
John Henry Johnson, he was back in the early 60s, because I got my notes here. So, and it looks like it took a while to get inducted into the Hall of Fame, because he got inducted in 1987, which is probably when you were still heading there for the enshrinements.
Yeah, I was there for the enshrinement, and then I'd see him at later ones because former Hall of Famers show up the rest of their lives at the ceremonies.
Those gold jackets are impressive.
Yeah, I loved going there. I remember in one instance when George Blanda was getting in, he invited me to his party on the eve of the Hall of Fame. The writers in, I think the newspaper was the Repository.
Yeah, the Canton Repository.
But what was the name of the sports editor? Do you remember the guy's name?
No.
But he was kind to me, and these were all like bubblegum cards come to life for me. You mentioned John Henry Johnson. I'll get this story, and this is what I think set me apart from the pack. John Henry was working in public relations for a gas company in Pittsburgh, and he'd show up at Froggy's popular saloon in the Market Square area.
Yeah, Froggy's. We have sorry, not to change the subject, but there's a table at the South Hills Country Club that, because Froggy used to come to the country club a lot, and a bunch of guys were friends with him, and they got the table. It's a round table, and there's inscriptions in it. Anyways, so I am familiar with Froggy's because Chuck Volker, who's a good friend of mine, Notre Dame alum, really, really tells great stories about Mr. Froggy.
Oh, he was an interesting character for sure. He was one of those saloon keepers. He was a big fan of Toots Shore, whom I've mentioned to you from New York, who was thought to be the saloon keeper in America, at least in New York, and popular with sports writers. So
back to John Henry Johnson.
He was tough. One time in a football game, he slammed Brett Schneider, who was a player for the Lions, I believe, and he hit him in the throat, and he really hurt him. So the next time when John Henry was running the ball, he was being chased. He didn't even have the ball in his hand. He was being chased to the sideline by his opponents. And when he got to the sideline, he grabbed the down marker from one of the officials. And if you remember those, they were like spears. And he started wielding it in the direction of these players who were chasing him so that they wouldn't get away from him. He also used to block in a certain way. Bobby Lane said that he and Fran Rogel were two of the toughest guys he ever played with in pro football. But one of the things John Henry would do was John Henry would take his fist and hold him against his stomach, and when a player came in, he would lift his hands up under their chin and really could knock them out.
Yeah, you can get a concussion that way.
He was so tough. So he was the
running back.
He was the first running back to gain over 1,000 yards after the age of 33 or 34, something like that.
And that was probably old, way old. I mean, that's true. That's old nowadays for especially for running backs. Right. Running backs' average life expectancy in the NFL is only like 3 years, and the good ones only stay 6 or 7.
Right, especially today.
Yeah, so there's not too many 30-year-old running backs in the league.
But
anymore.
I knew John Henry. I knew his wife. I knew his girlfriend.
Tell me about Bobby Lane.
Bobby Lane was another one who came to Pittsburgh late in his career and finished up with the Pittsburgh Steelers. I recently asked some people a trivia question, and two of them gave me the same answer, and I realized that it was okay, but it really wasn't the answer I was seeking. I said, "Who's the most famous Pittsburgher to play for the Detroit Lions?" And they said Charlie Batch. And I said, "No, it's not Charlie Batch." I said, "The most famous." I said, it was Joe Schmidt from Mount Oliver and from Brentwood High School and the University of Pittsburgh. And then I said, "What Lions quarterback finished up his career with the Pittsburgh Steelers?" Charlie Batch. Now, it was correct in this sense, but that's not who I was looking for. I said the most famous. That was Bobby Lane.
Wow.
So Bobby Lane.
Charlie Batch shots are fired.
Right. Well, I'm going to end up doing a story about Charlie Batch as a result of that because he came to mind. And
tell you what, he does a lot of good things to the community. Actually, I'm living down there, and he's building some type of foundation or a center.
Well, he's had a foundation there for a number of years and raised funds and everything. I participated in some of his fundraisers.
Listen, he's a good guy.
You know, a story on Charlie Batch.
No, we don't have time for Listen, Charlie, we're going to talk about Hall of Fame Steeler people.
One of our future shows.
Save the Charlie Batch story because that's going to be up there with all the other new guys. It's a good story.
Go ahead. Let's get back to the Hall of Famers.
So that era, you got Bobby Lane, you got John Henry Johnson, Ernie Stautner comes to mind from that era, defensive tackle in the Hall of Fame. Tell me a little bit about Ernie.
Ernie played for Boston College, and he was actually born in Bavaria. He wore number 70 up until the time that they retired the jersey of Joe Green, number 75. Stautner was the only player in Steelers history whose jersey was actually retired. Now, some of them were unofficially retired. The equipment managers didn't give out certain jerseys, even though they were not officially retired. They didn't give out Terry Bradshaw's jersey and Lynn Swann and Stallworth and people like that.
Yeah, they're going to run out of numbers here pretty soon in Pittsburgh.
Right, exactly. So Ernie Stautner used to go with Bobby Lane. They were drinking buddies. And they used to go to a place in Brentwood, Whitehall called Dante's, like Dante's Inferno. And show you the difference in times. I used to go there as a 20-year-old. I wasn't even legally able to be in a bar. And I went there not to be with the Steelers. It was the Steelers hangout. There were often as many as 15 to 20 Steelers drinking there in the evening. But there were also about 6 or 7 sports writers there in the evening, and that'll never happen again. Never happen again. Not only don't the players want to drink with sports writers, but today's players don't drink with each other.
No.
They don't go out socially.
They're not allowed to. Well, when they
go out with their buddies.
When they do, they get into trouble.
Yeah, they go out with their entourage. They all have 6 or 7 sycophants following them around. Well, how about that one?
I don't follow it anymore.
No, sycophants.
I don't even know. I have to look that word up. I dropped out of college.
But you are going to.
Sycophants. Can you give me a spelling, sir?
Right. SYCHOFPHANTS. Sycophants.
Sycophants. It's like elephants with a psycho elephant is what it looks like. A psycho elephant.
I don't want to torture you. Sycophants are people that are always kissing your butt and chasing after you because they want you to look after them kindly. So
Gotcha.
That's what a sycophant means.
So lots of Steelers in the Hall of Fame. It starts all the way back to the founder, Art Rooney Sr. Tell me, I know that you would have been, what year were you born?
One sec. We have to back up to Ernie Stautner. Ernie Stautner was his bodyguard, Bobby Lane. So anybody that would, Bobby Lane would be gruff and tough with people in a bar, give them a hard time. And then if anybody got out of hand, Ernie Stautner would step in. So he was the guy that saved us.
He was the cleaner.
Right, he was the cleaner. One time I was with my brother and my father, and we went to Dante's. And I told my dad on the way, I said, now, Dad, take it easy tonight. Pace yourself. What does my dad do? Since we get there, he orders an iron and an imperial, which was beer and a whiskey. So my brother comes to me at one point in the evening, and he says, Jim, he says, Ernie Stautner's giving Dad a bad time, and we're not going to put up with that. I said, yes, we are. Yes, we are. I grabbed my brother and my dad and ushered them out of the bar and took them home where they'd be safe from their own stupidity. But the chief got into the Hall of Fame because he was one of the most popular figures in the ownership ranks of the National Football League. Now, he doesn't get into the league as early as George Halas. Halas is in there about 5 or 6 years before the Steelers came into being. And the Steelers came into being in 1933. And for the first 4 years of their existence, they were known as the Pittsburgh Pirates. That had to be confusing for the readers. But it shows you that Art Rooney loved baseball. He loved baseball.
But why would they call it the same team? Because it was called the Pirates back from the beginning, right?
Because Art Rooney loved the Pirates and loved baseball.
I guess the media wasn't really covering. I mean, there was no media. You could
find a paragraph in the paper about the Steelers in those days.
Nobody really cared about football.
Pitt was a big deal. Duquesne was even a big deal. And Duquesne and Carnegie Mellon was a big deal. They were playing in national bowl games at that particular time. So it's a different era.
You have a whole book on the Chief. I do know that.
He's my favorite. He's one of my all-time favorites. He was just such a kindly man, and he enjoyed life, and he enjoyed people. And he told me once that if he weren't an owner, he would have wanted to be a sports writer, which is the highest calling, by the way, Ben. And the thing is that he said, I'd always go to the losing locker room first because that's where the action is.
Well, I mean, yeah, if you're trying to get
the sound effects on that one.
No, wrong one. There we go. How about this one? No, that's the laughs. I gotta fix these sound effects. I don't know where they're at. So, but back in that era, there was also a halfback that's in the Hall of Fame, John Mcnally. And then he also became a coach. So he was probably one of the Chiefs' buddies.
Yeah, he was. Johnny Blood, his nickname was Johnny Blood McNally. And he actually had played for, I think he played for the Green Bay Packers. He didn't play a lot for the Steelers, but he was a colorful character and obviously a good football player at the time. I met him. He was at the Steelers' 50th season celebration at the convention center, the David L. Lawrence Convention Center. And I have a picture of myself with Johnny Blood McNally and Jack Lambert. Now, Jack Lambert could have had a nickname like Blood. It would have fit.
John McNally must have been pretty good. I mean, he was in that inaugural bunch that got enshrined in Canton, along with Burt Bell. Burt Bell, co-owner.
Yeah, Burt Bell was a co-owner and then, of course, got involved with the Philadelphia Eagles. And that's why you have a team called the Steagles, because they were so close to each other that whenever in World War II, when there was a shortage of players because they were in the military service in many cases. So you had the Steagles, and Burt Bell was the owner of that team. He later became the commissioner of the National Football League, Burt Bell. And
really?
Yes. And his son.
Before Pete Roselle?
Yes, before Roselle.
Was it Bell and then Roselle? Or was there someone in between?
Good question.
Ooh, there we go.
Positive.
Ooh, I got one trivia question.
We'll have to check that out.
Who was the commissioner before Pete Roselle?
Yeah. Pete Roselle was the best, and there's still things that happen today, decisions that are made that never would have been made with Pete Roselle. And I'll tell you one of the ones that comes quickly to mind. The NFL, like most pro sports, was so holier than thou about the way its stance in regard to betting. They suspended players for betting on games and stuff like that. Now you have Jerome Bettis on television and Peyton Manning and anybody else who can get a buck.
Big dollars, man.
Right. And the NFL finally decided that, you know what? We can make some money off this.
Oh, so much money.
Right.
Yeah.
I think there was just a record set for the billions of dollars that were in 1 month that were bet on.
It's insane. Yeah. Well, and the guys that are rolling over are all the Italians and Boston and New York City. Those guys have been running numbers for years now. They're out of business probably because now it's like
Well, they always paid. I know growing up that I was surrounded by a lot of bookmakers. They always paid a little better than say the Pennsylvania Lottery or something like that. I don't know what the status of it is now. I remember my dad used to play the numbers every day, and he'd say, what are you going to do with a buck? What are you going to do with a buck? And then when he'd win, he'd give a handsome tip to the bookmaker. And I'd say, does he give you any money when you lose?
They give him a free play. It's called a free play.
And this thing today, they lure you in. They're going to give you money up front.
Oh, yeah.
They're going to get you in.
Oh, if you lose your first bet, we'll give you $1,000.
Right.
Yeah.
And then you got to pay that off. And the thing is about that is they say
we're rabbit trailing.
It's easy. It's easy to
It's easy
win.
money.
Yeah.
Somebody's got to win.
It's easier money to lose.
I'm sure your dad, if you took all those dollars, man, you would have had a great inheritance.
I'm the only one in my family.
You would have had a great inheritance if you would have kept all those dollars.
Yeah, my dad enjoyed himself, so I can't complain. But the thing is, I was the only one in my family. I mean, my mom and my sister, they were big bingo players. My mother played the numbers. My dad played the numbers. My brothers both bet a lot on sports. The only time I was in a Atria's a week ago, and some guy at the bar was annoying. And my wife says, it seems like a lot more people annoy you these days. This guy was going on, and he was betting that Purdue was going to beat Ohio State in football.
Wow.
I wanted a part of that action. And I was sitting there with my wife, Kathy, and I said to the guy, hey, buddy. And he didn't look my way because he probably couldn't hear that well. I said, I want a piece of that action. And my wife said, please, don't get him over here. Don't get him over. I was so sure that Ohio State was going to be able to take Purdue. And I would have bet fairly good, whatever the guy was willing to go for. I was that sure of it. Of course, about a week later, I was sure that Ohio State was going to win again, and they got beat by Michigan. So I didn't know. I found in my lifetime that the more you know about sports, the less you know about gambling.
Just bet the other side. That's all. Bet the other side. So during that era when players were going into the military, right? Because back then you would play professional sports. They'd call you to the draft. You'd have to go, right?
Right.
Did they have the draft in World War II, or was it just like
World War II? Yes,
they had the draft there and Vietnam, right?
And in Korea.
Okay, so
some athletes like Bob Feller of the Cleveland Indians, and the one that really lost the years was Ted Williams. I think he lost about 5 years. He was an ace pilot in World War II and Korea.
It's back when they were real men.
Yes.
So Bill Dudley, who's in Canton, must have been a halfback. He was a halfback. It said he played 1942, and then there's a comma, 1945 to 46. So he either left pro football to go to the military, or maybe he played for another team.
He played for another team. He played for both the Detroit Lions and the Washington Redskins, the Washington football team. He's like one of the biggest names in the state of Virginia. He was an All-America at the University of Virginia. My daughter went to the University of Virginia, Sarah, and the day that we visited Virginia, I had breakfast with Boyd Bill Dudley at a local Boar's Inn. It wasn't called a Boar's Inn because of me, but Boyd Bill Dudley's one of the neatest guys I've ever met in sports, and he was a legislator in Virginia. He was a very prominent pro football alumnus. He did not like Jock Sutherland, who had coached at the University of Pittsburgh and then became the Steelers coach. And Jock Sutherland was always referred to as the dour Scotsman. He lived at the PAA in Oakland, the Pittsburgh Athletic Association, which is right there on the Pitt campus. And Boyd Bill Dudley told me a story about one day he went to a luncheon there, and as he walked through the lobby, Sutherland ignored him. Just ignored him, looked the other way, because he felt as if Boyd Bill Dudley was on his turf. Like he was at this private club and he had no business being there, which Dudley ended up forcing a trade. Dudley is probably, I'm not positive about this, but he might be the last player who led the NFL in rushing, in interceptions, and in kickoff returns.
Wow.
One time I was at Walden Books at South Hills Village, and a guy came up to me and told me that he remembered seeing Boyd Bill Dudley return a kick for the Redskins of that time for a touchdown. So I said to the guy, hold on here a second. And I called Boyd Bill on the phone in Lynchburg, Virginia. And I said, Bill, I've got a guy here who says he saw you score a touchdown against the Steelers at Forbes Field. And I said, I'm going to put you on with him, okay? And we both listened, and Boyd Bill says, oh, yeah, I remember that. He said, Joe Gary punted the ball for the Steelers, and I fielded it near the left sideline. I said, I was just a foot inside of the sideline where I caught it. And I said, I hesitated a moment because I didn't want to step out of bounds. But I think that the Steelers thought I had stepped out of bounds. And he said, then I took off and ran for a touchdown. And I remember that day.
Just like it was yesterday.
Now, you can imagine how a guy coming up to buy a book from me at a bookstore in South Hills Village is
that was called bonus material. So he paid $30 for the book, and he got that bonus story for the rest of his life.
Exactly.
That's how you over-deliver value, Jim. That's why you're one of the best.
Well, I feel fortunate that I met somebody like Boyd Bill Dudley. He asked me that morning, I was going to go later to pick up my daughter to tour the campus at the University of Virginia. Mm-hmm. And he said to me, "So what does your daughter think of the university?" Well, we'd been going to North Carolina. We'd been going to, I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "We call the University of Virginia the university." And I said, "Oh,
They're
okay."
like the Ohio State
I said, "Oh, okay."
Yeah.
So and Sarah ended up going there. And
it's kind of like the Big Fish Cares podcast.
Exactly. But I've, every just doing a show like this that we're doing, Ben, it just reminds me of what a magical tour I've been on since I was a kid. And you had an early enthusiasm about sports, and that's how you ended up getting to.
When you live in the Hall of Fame city, I mean,
Right.
it's hard not to. And then I'm always enamored with it. And being around it. And then when I moved to Pittsburgh, learned about the traditions here, and then getting to meet you that one day at the home show, I'm thinking like, oh, wow, here's a guy who's ran into everybody, and I can talk to him and ask questions as much as I want, and he's just going to keep answering.
Well, Charles Woodson, now, when you say, of course, you lived in Canton, Ohio, so I'm sure there were a lot of people your age in Canton, Ohio, who'd never been in the Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
Charles Woodson was inducted into the Hall of Fame last year in Canton, Ohio, and he said during the induction ceremony that I forget how close by he lived. He never had been there. I remember one year at the Steelers training camp, one of the Steelers was getting into the Hall of Fame. And Joe Green, who was now a coach with the Steelers, suggested to Bill Cowher that they not practice that Saturday, and they take the whole team on 2 buses and travel to Canton, Ohio to see a Steeler getting into the Hall of Fame. And so Joe had the right instincts. That's what you do when you're a teacher. You take all the players to Canton, Ohio, so that while they're still playing for you, they experience what it's like to be someday honored in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. It has to be inspirational. It has to give you more direction to stay the course.
Motivation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So he didn't.
Well, we're going to get back. I'm going to cover that whole run of all those Steeler greats in the 70s, but we got one Hall of Famer that we haven't mentioned yet, Jack Butler, cornerback in the 50s, inducted in 2012. Tell me about Jack Butler, because that's probably a name on this list that not a lot of people know about.
Well, Jack Butler was, I keep saying this, was a good guy. He grew up in Munhall. He initially came out of Oakland, but when he got married and so forth, he lived in Munhall near the Carnegie Library of Homestead. The Carnegie Library of Homestead is actually in Munhall.
Yeah, well, I mean, right down there, it's hard to tell. Right.
So he was an end in the beginning. When there was such a thing as an end. You don't hear anybody called an end anymore.
Like a defensive end?
No, he was an offensive end.
Offensive
and it was just end.
And there's no tight end. There was no
that
right.
came later.
Okay.
And you didn't hear them called receivers.
He's like a right end and a left end. Is that
exactly?
Okay.
Exactly.
All right.
And they didn't even have a middle linebacker in those days. They had a center. And one day, Bill George from Waynesburg, Pennsylvania, and the Chicago Bears, they were getting killed by a quarterback throwing the ball right over the line. So he backed up a few steps. And that's how you got a middle linebacker. That was the creation of the middle linebacker. And Pittsburgh and Western Pennsylvania actually turned out a lot of great linebackers. And we mentioned Ernie Stautner. He was terrific playing a linebacker position or sometimes defensive end.
Well, linebackers lead us into, the 70s Steelers, which is the Steelers that everybody knows and everybody's, famous for. It seems like that's probably what kind of cemented the Steel City of Champions and that whole, with the Pirates winning some, thing. Well, how many World Series the Pirates? 5 World Series?
Yes. And Jack Butler was a part of building, he and Bill Nunn were a part of building that Steeler dynasty because
Bill Nunn, Hall of Famer.
Jack Butler became a favorite of the Steelers. I mean, he had played with Fran Rogel and George Tarasovic and Ted Marchibroda and those guys. And he became a defensive backfield player and sometimes played both ways, which they did in those days sometimes. So Butler had a long career, and then he was one of the first scouts for an organization called Blesto V. and let me see if I can remember. Blessed OV was a scouting organization for several teams. They provided information to B, the Bears, L, the Lions, E, the Eagles, S, the Steelers, T, who's T? Which team is T? And then O is for organization, and V is for Vikings. Blessed V. That was one of the late teams, Minnesota Vikings.
That's a lot of information. It's just Jim O'Brien. He has information for days.
But Jack Butler was the head of that.
So when he was friends with Bill Nunn?
He was friends with Bill Nunn and Art Rooney Jr., the two people who were the mainstays, along with Dick Haley, of the Steelers scouting staff.
Tell me about Dan Rooney, because like Dan Rooney was pretty much in charge of the organization, right? During the 70s run. Bill Nunn was what'd you say he was, the scout?
Well, Bill Nunn had been a sports writer for the Pittsburgh Courier newspaper in the Hill District, which was one of the nation's top black-related publications. It was big, and people bought it in New York, Chicago, and everything else, even though they had their own black newspapers at the time. So Bill Nunn's his father was the managing editor. He's the sports editor. And I did some writing for the Courier whenever I was just out of college because I was doing public relations for a minor league football team. But Bill Nunn was a good guy, and he ran the camp for the Steelers. Like, he was the director of the camp. He did the pairings for who was going to room with who and all that sort of thing. And he knew enough to give Jack Lambert a room at the end of the hall by himself. And Nunn was a good guy. But see, Nunn used to pick an all-black school All-America team for the Courier each year. So he knew all the coaches. He knew people like Jake Gaither at Florida A&M. He knew people like Eddie Robinson at Grambling and so forth. And that gave the Steelers a tremendous edge because he was familiar with all the people and he knew the good players. So that's how they end up with John Stallworth. That's how they end up with Mel Blount.
I mean, was Dan Rooney the guy that was in charge of making sure that Bill Nunn was, like, in charge?
Right. Bill Nunn had been in a part-time scout for the Steelers before Dan Rooney took over the Steelers. And Dan Rooney's first hire as a coach, like I said, he was lucky. He got the right man. He hired Chuck Noll. And he also later fired his brother, Art Rooney Jr., which no one could believe that at the time. But I think Art Rooney Jr. talked too much, which was great as far as I was concerned. And I don't think Noll was fond of his style. He was most like his father.
How was Dan Rooney and Art Rooney Jr.? Tell me the relationship.
Oh, I think they got along well.
But how were they related? Were they brothers?
Brothers.
They were brothers, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Dan Rooney is the firstborn. And in Irish families in particular, just
I'm confused because I don't understand how that works.
Just like in England, which I think is not the best way to run a company, but the oldest son got first dibs, and so Dan Rooney's the oldest of the Steeler family, the Rooney family, and then comes Art Rooney Jr., who is most like his father. Then comes Tim Rooney, who ended up owning Yonkers Raceway. And then comes the twins, Pat and John, who ran Liberty Bell in Philadelphia, which was a harness racing track, and they also owned the track in West Palm Beach. They had a raceway there for Greyhound racing and so forth. So all those places, Greyhound racing has been eliminated. They're now basically casinos. They're casinos. But they were making a lot of money at those places.
So the Rooneys had their hands in everything, it seemed like, and that was all probably from all the Steelers, money that they made, right?
And they allowed him to do that. I mean, the NFL really didn't like owners being involved with gambling. Today, of course, they celebrate it, which goes, that's why they should revisit the whole business about Pete Rose. Pete Rose should be in the Baseball Hall of Fame, even though he broke rules at the time, but they were hypocritical rules.
Yeah, but they got an image to maintain.
I lost a job. I lost a job one time in Miami over the gambling topic.
Well, listen, save that story because that's a good story. We're going to hook all the episode listeners, and we're going
Lenny Dawson. Remember that name, Lenny
I know
Dawson.
Lenny Dawson, Alliance, Ohio.
Right.
Yeah, of course, Lenny Dawson. Let's get back to, give me a story about Dan Rooney. Did you ever meet Dan Rooney?
Oh, yes.
So tell me about like the
I have
most.
some letters at home in my files from Dan Rooney, who died about 5 years ago. I got along fine with Dan Rooney most of my life, but then when I wrote the books about his dad and about Dan and about Chuck Noll, all of a sudden, I was on his S list, never to be removed. And they used to sell my books as Steelers, and under Dan Rooney, they quit selling my books. And so he wanted to hurt me, and he did. But I still went to his funeral at Fry Vogel's out in Shadyside.
Chuck
He
Noll,
was a bright guy. He went to Duquesne University.
Did he have a choice?
No.
No, so he didn't have a choice.
Well, it was a smart school for a Rooney to go to because Father Mcnally, who was the president of Duquesne University, was also a friend of the Rooneys. The Kathleen Rooney's maiden name was Kathleen Mcnally, okay?
Okay.
It was spelled differently, but they were cousins of some kind. And the Rooneys could get anybody into law school at Duquesne and did it from time to time. They had the connections. And Dan Rooney was actually, and this is heresy in Pittsburgh, Dan Rooney, even though Dan Rooney ended up not being a fan of mine, Dan Rooney deserved to be in the Pro Football Hall of Fame even more than his father. He ran the team as a business.
Yeah.
He didn't hire old chumps. In fact, if anything, he dismissed a few.
Well, tell me how he hired Chuck Noll. Tell me the Chuck Noll story. What do you know about him? He was the longtime Steeler coach.
Well, their first choice was
There's only been
Joe
three
Paterno.
coaches. There's only been three coaches since 1969.
Right. Joe Paterno was the first choice. And he was interested. But he was a college football coach. And he was smart enough, unlike these guys today. He belonged at Penn State. And it's a shame how tragically, really, his career ended at Penn State and how his reputation was besmirched by things that his coaches did and stuff like that, and his not paying attention to enforcing.
Well, when you're the CEO of the organization,
You're responsible.
You're responsible.
The buck stops here.
So how did Chuck Noll get the job? Who was Chuck Noll back in 1969, and why did he get the job?
Well, Chuck Noll played for Paul Brown in Cleveland. He was a two-way player. He was a linebacker and he was a guard, so he played both ways. He was often the messenger, the one that brought in the play from the sideline for Paul Brown. So he was a bright guy, and people who played with him on the Browns say that they used to give tests. Paul Brown was the first coach to give intellectual or intelligence tests of the players. He believed smart players played smart. Dumb people tended to get penalties and got hurt.
Did he come up with the Wonderlick?
He came up with the taxi squad.
I'm not sure what that is. I just know the quarterbacks, they take the Wonderlick test, to see how smart they were, and some of them are good scores, and some of them don't get any scores.
Well, the taxi squad is interesting because that was the first reserve squad, and the reason it was called a taxi squad. Now, you might write this one down because this is a good one. Brown got the taxi squad players jobs driving taxi cabs in Cleveland. That's where they made their money. Today, they make several $100,000 being on that.
All they got to do is promote the taxi squad now. All they got to do is say, hey, come drive with taxi squad and get $1 million.
Right. And most of those guys would be better off if they drove Ubers.
So let me ask you this about Chuck Noll. So was Chuck Noll great because Chuck Noll was an amazing mastermind of football and coaching, or was he a byproduct of they made some really good selections in the draft? They got all these Hall of Famers that won 4 Super Bowls. Tell me the real,
Well, I often think that's difficult to determine because another team that I covered in New York City was the New York Knicks. I covered them. I was part of a reporting team that covered them in 1970 when they won their first NBA title. They had a great lineup, and I often felt that several of them were better because of who they were playing next to, that they complemented one another, that they worked well, the chemistry was great. And I think with the Steelers, Jack Ham was thought to be the best linebacker on the Steelers, and they had Andy Russell and they had Jack Lambert. But I think that each one of them helped the other look better. You know, they could take chances on certain things. And Terry Bradshaw, I just saw a documentary on Bradshaw recently, and I remembered an afternoon that I was at the stadium, Three River Stadium, and I was on the sideline watching practice, much closer than you can watch it these days. And I remember one play in particular. They came out of the huddle, and John Stallworth came close to me on the sideline. He was on the left sideline. And Terry Bradshaw takes the snap from center, and Stallworth runs down the field toward the defensive back and then goes left to the sideline, and Bradshaw hits him right on the mark. He threw the ball, released the ball before Stallworth even made the break. So being the intrepid reporter that I fancied myself, I went to Bradshaw and I said, how did you know to throw the ball when you did? And he said, because of the way the defensive back lined up. John was on the outside of him. If he's on the outside, he's going to run to the outside. If the defensive back is closer to the sideline, John's going to go down and run inside of him.
He's going to go the opposite way.
So you learn. You learn by going to practice. I mean, there were some writers that felt that going to practice was a waste of time.
What was your relationship like with Terry Bradshaw? How often would you see him? When it was only in the locker room? Like, give me some insight on that.
Well, first of all, I wasn't a drinking buddy with any of the Pittsburgh Steelers. I'm probably closer today with Rocky Bleier and Franco Harris. And Franco was a reluctant interview when he played for the Steelers. He didn't want to be bothered. But he was never rude or anything like that.
I mean, would you get these guys, would you get Terry Bradshaw one-on-one, or was it only just, so you would say, hey, you request it through the Steelers front office, and then they just tell later. They tell Bradshaw that, hey, O'Brien's down here, he wants to talk to you.
That happened once in a while, but normally you could just grab them coming off the field.
But it was never outside of the of the Three River Stadium, or
never ate hamburgers with any of them, and or drank with any of them.
But they knew who you were. If Terry Bradshaw is listening right now, would he remember who Jim O'Brien is?
He might. He's like me. His memory's not as good as it used to be. But Terry's a hoot. Terry was
he's
funny.
Hilarious on Fox NFL Sunday. I mean, he's made a career.
He always had something to say to us. Now, he might tell me one thing and then the next writer another thing. But he was always fun to be around. And there's no doubt in my mind that Joe Green thought that Franco Harris was the key element, that we never won blank before he came along. But I think Terry Bradshaw was the key to the whole thing. And he was a nervous wreck. The thing that Terry Bradshaw would be the nervous wreck on the night before a game. I mean, he had certain guys that were in the organization that used to sit and babysit him at night in the hotels, just to calm him down and so forth. But Terry benefited by Chuck Noll being his coach. And when you say, was it Noll or was it the personnel? I think it was both. I think Noll was the right coach for the Steelers at that particular time. He certainly was the right coach, even though Terry Bradshaw didn't think he was the right coach. He was the coach that was best for Terry Bradshaw, in my opinion. And the one thing about that Steelers team, because of Art Rooney and Joe Gordon, the public relations man, their locker room was open. You could go in there and talk to anybody you wanted to talk to. And
why does it seem that Terry Bradshaw, though, and the people of Pittsburgh, why does it seem like there's such a divide? Like he never, is it just because he's all about Hollywood right now? And but it doesn't seem like he's ever really warmly welcomed back in Pittsburgh. It seems like it's always awkward. There's been, I think on that 75th anniversary team and some different things that happen. Like when he comes back to town, they always talk about he's almost he's shunned. Tell me why that happens.
Well, somebody just asked me that question about Terry recently, and they asked me, why wasn't he at Chuck Noll's funeral? Why didn't he attend?
Yeah, we talked about that a couple weeks ago.
And I said he made a bad decision. And he admits now that he made a bad decision. And I think that people, whether they play football or whether they play basketball or whether they're accountants or whether they're bankers, sometimes they make a bad decision.
Yeah, but like why? But why doesn't like? He's a huge celebrity, right? Like like he never comes back to Pittsburgh. Like, is it just because it's like it just doesn't seem like it's the same with all the other Steelers.
Well, he's created in his mind a problem that never really existed except in his mind. Chuck Noll treated him the same way he treated everybody else. In fact, Terry Hanratty, who was the backup quarterback to Bradshaw, says that Noll spent more time with Terry Bradshaw than any other player on the team. So he said he has no reason to complain. And, when you ask me about relationship with the players, I wouldn't want to cover the Pittsburgh Steelers today. You have no access. You can't go in the locker room. And this pandemic is just, I'll tell you one thing right now. When and if this pandemic is ever finally concluded or put to rest, the Steelers and every other team in pro sports is going to take advantage of the way things became. And there will be a carryover because the locker rooms will not be open as they once were. I mean, you could go up to St. Vincent and you could be, first of all, they made rules under Bill Cowher that the riders had to stay behind a certain line on this side of the field and that side of the field. So they put more ropes up. They put more security guards up there. They started having the players transport themselves around the campus on a golf cart. That was so they didn't have to sign autographs or stop. And the players never complained about that, not to my knowledge. And they just made too many rules. And it wasn't as much fun to go to St. Vincent anymore. Now, today, the Steelers haven't been to St. Vincent in 2 years. And I wouldn't be surprised if they never go back again.
Those guys don't want to sleep in those bunk beds in there.
Well, they don't have to. They have a hotel right next to the practice field on the south side.
I know, that's what I'm saying. Like, they're going to stay in hotels.
Art Rooney's dead, and Dan Rooney's dead.
Yeah. Well,
and Art Rooney Jr., who went to school at St. Vincent, he doesn't have any say. So even though he's a minority owner of the team, he's not involved in the decisions making.
So you mentioned getting back to the Steelers offense in the 70s. Bradshaw, obviously a Hall of Famer. Huge celebrity in the TV commentary business right now, as many people know. But he threw the ball to Stallworth and Swan, and you mentioned Stallworth a little bit. So tell me about John Stallworth.
Well, John Stallworth and Swan, they're in a documentary right now on 30 on 30, and it starts off with Lynn Swan saying, "I don't know why we had to do this together. I'd rather just do this one-on-one, each of us." But they were always paired, and in my book, Pittsburgh, the Story of the City of Champions, the Marty Wolfson drew cartoon of both of them on the same page. They were always paired, Swan and Stallworth. And both came from different cultures. Swan comes from Southern Cal, and Swan had gone to dancing school as a young man because his mother really didn't want him playing football. And some of his acrobatic moves as a football player came from his days learning how to dance. So you've got him from L.A., the Hollywood look and so forth. And then you got Stallworth coming from Alabama. Didn't get recruited by the University of Alabama because the coaches there at the time, they didn't draft black players. Now the team is, the highest percentage of players on the team are black, and I'm always curious about that. I often wonder why today's guys are so willing to play for schools such as Auburn and Alabama when once they were rejected. But that's just me. The thing is that Stallworth...
Notoriety. You want to go to Alabama because it's Alabama, and you want to, they have rich tradition.
Exactly. But that tradition once excluded blacks from being on the team.
Well, now we're trying to make it more inclusive to everybody, Jim.
We're trying to make it so you have the best players on the field.
And Alabama has the best players on the field.
Exactly. It's all selfish. These coaches, first of all, my feeling is that if you want to make a lot of money as a football coach, you should have to go to the NFL. These colleges paying guys $7, $8, $9, $10 million. That's absurd.
Well, how about this? So I graduated, and this is a really big rabbit trail, but this happens on the Big Fish Cares podcast. I graduated from Perry High School between Canton and Massillon, and I graduated in 99, and I used to be in school with a guy named Matt Campbell, who's now the coach at Iowa State. And I've been watching him, and he's a year older than me. And I remember being in study hall with him and chatting with him. And he was always a well-mannered guy and a good football player. And it's just fun to watch him now. He's up for the job at either USC. I think they said there's another job. I forget what other job, but that was the job that they were thinking about. But he's already making like probably $4 or $5 million a year. So you get to that top school level. You're right, $7-8 million a year, man. You don't have to work for like a year and you're set.
Well, I have a feeling about that too, and it's this. Sometimes coaches, whether they're basketball coaches, baseball managers, or whatever they coach, they don't realize that they already have the best job. I mean, maybe Iowa State is the best environment, the best, he feels comfortable, he's got a good team, it works, and it's just like, a lot of coaches used to have in their contract that the one job they were allowed to be able to leave was like Notre Dame.
Yeah.
They could go to Notre Dame. And now you've got Kelly leaving Notre Dame to go coach at LSU. Well, I'll tell you one guy that's hoping that he's an utter failure at LSU, and that's Jim O'Brien. I never liked him as a coach at Notre Dame, but and I never was a big Notre Dame fan, but I'm a fan of many of the players that played at Notre Dame because many of them were from Western Pennsylvania, and some of the greatest players that they've ever had at Notre Dame came from Western Pennsylvania. So, and you can't grow up in a Catholic environment and not be a Notre Dame fan. It's part of the religion.
Notre Dame, they have a rich tradition, but lately it's really not been anything since I've been alive. So, I mean, all I hear about is the rich tradition, and I remember the movie Rudy when I was a kid, right. And but like I don't know, I grew up in the '90s, and even from now, the last 20 years, I mean, yeah, Notre Dame's had a couple of chances where they like looked like they were good. They always do play a tough schedule. Because everybody wants them for the TV game. I never did understand why NBC had a special deal with them where they showed every Notre Dame game. And I'm realizing it's because there's people all over the country, old people probably, that like pay money to like see Notre Dame.
Exactly.
So that's you follow the money and then you see and you understand where it's.
When I was a student at Pitt in the '60s, 1960 to '64, when they had a good team, Notre Dame would come to Pitt and it would fill the Pitt Stadium. And normally it would be maybe 2/3 filled at best. But Notre Dame, half the crowd was rooting for Notre Dame. And it was that way wherever they played. I mean, they used to play games at Yankee Stadium in New York. Army would play there, Notre Dame. When I was a teenager, when you would go to the movie theater on Saturday, in addition to having cartoons and stuff like that, they would always have a newsreel. And the sports segment of the newsreel, it was like the only two football teams in America were Army and Notre Dame. That's all you ever saw.
Yeah. And
the thing is, in Western Pennsylvania in particular, we can talk about that in another one of our podcasts. Plenty of material to work with. But we turned out some Heisman Trophy winners from Western Pennsylvania who played at Notre Dame.
So I want to cover two more Steelers because we're not going to run out of time on this episode. But so we talked about Bradshaw. We talked about the two wide receivers, Swan and Stallworth. But the man under center, Mike Webster, interesting character. I remember when he got inducted into the Hall of Fame in 1997. That's when I was, in high school, and my mom was dropping me off and stuff, and I would hear these stories about Mike Webster. Tell me a good story about Mike Webster. A good story, and then a not so good story.
Well,
maybe.
The Mike Webster that I knew was he came from a farm. He came from a farm in Wisconsin, Tomahawk, Wisconsin. How about that? And
is that close to Appleton?
I don't know that.
Oh,
I don't know. I hope so.
It's a big state.
Yes, but he like a lot of the Steelers. When he came to the Steelers, he was undersized for an offensive lineman. So guess what? Players like him and John Kolb, for instance, Larry Brown, they got a lot bigger when they were with the Steelers, and one of the main reasons was steroids and a weight program. Noll really was into the weight program. So he grew up, and it was all about family, football, and faith, the three F's. And Mike was so solidly grounded and so forth, and he was just a solid citizen. And then I remember toward the end of his days with the Steelers, I remember seeing him in the locker room after a game where he could barely walk. He was walking around the room like a duck. And then he goes and retires from the Steelers, and he goes to Kansas City as a coach. And soon after he's there, they find out that he's better than the center that they have for the Chiefs, and he plays 2 more years of football. And I remember when I saw him walking around the locker room in Pittsburgh, I thought he's going to end up like Jim Otto of the Oakland Raiders. Won't be able to walk, or like Earl Campbell, will require a walker or a cane or whatever. His knees are going to be shot. And that was the case. And then the other thing was that he took too many hits to the head. I mean, he suffered too many concussions. His brain was rattled. And this guy who was so solid and ends up getting, breaks up with his wife, has a strange relationship going forward with his children. I think he had 2 daughters and a son. And he ends up sleeping in his car, just a lost soul. And I remember participating in some fundraisers where he was raising money for his charity with spina bifida. And he was really loved, and he was such a solid citizen and so forth. And it all went down the tank.
You think that was due to the concussions?
Yes.
Wow. I'll have to get into that sometime.
And that's why I can't, you see Boswell, the kicker, after every kick, 7, 8 guys come up and bang his helmet with their helmet. And I watched that.
Stupidity.
And I said, what's going on here? Because it's not one hit or 2 hits. Yeah. It's the repetition.
It's like the love taps.
And Boswell's not a football player to begin with, so don't bother him.
Me and you probably could take him out of the
coach,
backyard.
he looks like somebody. He looks like rats have gnawed at him.
So we talked about we talked about half the Steelers of the 70s, the offense, and you mentioned Franco Harris last week, but let's talk, just give me one more story about Franco Harris that nobody knows.
Well, his father's name, they used to call him Cad, but his real name was Cadillac. Okay, his first name was Cadillac. And he was an Army sergeant. So Franco's early days were spent, one in particular comes to mind, Fort Ord in New Jersey. And Franco's mother was an Italian woman from Italy who was a war bride. That was an expression at the time. Soldiers would meet women in China, Japan, places like that, Italy, and have a relationship, and the next thing you know, they'd bring them home. The thing you got to be careful about that, I remember when I was in the Army, I almost brought a young woman home to meet my parents, and when I got home, I'd never talk to her again. You get lonely. You get lonely when you're in the military service, and you have to be careful about that. But anyhow, Franco, his mother and father got married, and that was a mixed marriage in that day. And the thing is that Franco was an all-around athlete. He loved to play basketball. Even when he played for the Steelers, he used to go out to the Pitt campus and play basketball with the students out there, and he was quite good. And the thing is that all those athletes had to make choices. I see you have a helmet here on your desk from Joe Namath. Namath was an outstanding baseball player, was an outstanding basketball player. Joe Willie would shoot a shot from the corner right before the half, release the ball, and start walking to the locker room.
Wow.
I mean, he knew it was going in. So
he had that confidence.
And Danny Marino was drafted in by the Kansas City Royals.
John Elway was a fantastic baseball player.
Right, so they had to make a choice.
Deion Sanders, Bo Jackson, those guys played both ways and did it well.
Yeah, and the thing today, it's a pity, is a lot of high school coaches won't allow the players to play 2 or 3 sports.
Oh, one sport, baby. All year round, man. They're in the weight room. Sports is totally different than it was back in the day. But let's we got a lot more content to talk about with Steelers and Hall of Famers. It's going to take us more than 2 episodes. So we'll come back next week. We'll go over that whole steel curtain defense. We'll talk about all the current, players of the Steelers over the last, I call them current, but over the last 20 years, there's been a few.
I got a Jack Butler story. We didn't cover him that well. Can I give you a Jack Butler story?
Sure, hurry up.
Jack Butler grew up in Oakland, and one of his contemporaries was Frank Thomas, the original Frank Thomas, who played for the Pittsburgh Pirates. So both of them thought that they had a calling, that they were going to become priests. So they went to a seminary in Canada near Niagara Falls. They went to a seminary at the same time. And when they played ball there, it's kind of like the Babe Ruth story. Frank Thomas and the Butler had a bat lefty instead of righty because they'd hit the ball over the wall and stuff like that, and they were too good for the rest of the players. So they both go to the seminary, and they both ended up leaving the seminary, didn't become priests. And the thing that's interesting about that is they both fathered 8 children, 4 boys and 4 girls in both cases, okay? And were married for a long, long time. And the thing is that there's 2 guys that could be, could have been doing sermons in Bloomfield or something like that, and instead they end up as 2 of Pittsburgh's favorite all-time athletes. And Butler, he hurt one of his legs playing pro football, and he had a serious limp the rest of his life, when he was a Blesto V executive and so forth. But you don't even hear about Blesto V anymore.
Never even heard of it. I'm still the listeners at home are probably going to have to go Google it if they want more information. If it's even on Google, it might be so old it's not on Google, people. So you never know.
Well, he ended up going to St. Bonaventure, and guess what? The athletic director at St. Bonaventure was Father Silas Rooney, the brother of Art Rooney.
They're all connected. They're all connected, Jim. Well, listen, I can't wait to have you back next week. We'll talk about the Steeler defense of the '70s, the current Hall of Famers, and
Ernie Holmes. There's the story.
We could go on all day, but we're going to cut it off today. Thanks, and I really do appreciate this opportunity to kind of, what I told you before we were live is, I feel like I'm got to get my practice in, so then that way when I start to interview different guests that aren't so talkative, I can, hopefully pry them for more information. So we'll see everyone next week.
Thank you for listening to the Big Fish Cares podcast.